Seated next to Mr. Brown is representative from Random House, the publisher of the book, Lillian Penchansky, and we thank Lillian for arranging. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest today. Penny Colman is a widely published, award-winning author of books, essays, and stories and articles. Her books for young readers include Rosie the Riveter, Women Working on the Home Front, for which was an American Library Association notable book, a School Library Journal Best Book for Young Adults, and the winner of the Orbis Pictus Honor Award. She is also, her latest book is Where the Action Was, is her 10th book on women's history. In addition to researching and writing, Penny takes photographs and does extensive picture research for her books. She has appeared on television and radio, including Nickelodeon's Nick News with Linda Ellerby and the Loose Leaf Book Company with Tom Bodett. Penny currently teaches at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York City, and is really a neighbor of ours. She resides in Englewood, New Jersey. Let's give her a nice, warm welcome to Penny Colman.
I'm delighted to be here. It's always fun to come to a neighboring school. And I'm going to start by asking you a question. What year were you born?
1987.
1987. When were you born?
88.
Now, do you think one of these adults is going to answer me?
No.
No? She will. Lillian will. When were you born?
1951.
1951. How about Mr. Brown?
1953.
1953. How about the people with the hat? Do you see them? Can you all see who's sitting over here? Would you stand up? Here we've got the Foreign Legion. Okay.
And isn't that a marvelous thing that we have a commander of the American Legion as a woman today?
A woman, yes. There we go. And you were born in?
25.
1925.
I'm a youngster. 1932.
She said she's a youngster, 1932. Now, thank you. Now, I was born in, what would you guess? Probably not 1932, right? Probably not 1925, right? Probably not 1989. No. 87. No, probably not then. What would you guess? Yes, we're close. 1944. 1944, I know I'm a kid, right? 1944. Now, all of you who are history students, does that mean I was born before World War II began, in the middle of World War II, or after World War II ended? Oh, goodness, yay, Glen Rock, there you go. Yes. So our two folks over here were born before. I was born actually 1944, the year before the war ended. And actually, my birthday is September 2nd, and that's the very day that the Japanese signed the surrender on board the battleship Missouri, September 2nd, 1945. Not that celebrating my first birthday, I would have known that, but it's a coincidence. So I grew up in what's called the post-war years. And when I was growing up, all the kind of history that I knew and the discussion that I knew about World War II was all about the soldiers. It was all about the men. It was about the fighting. And I had 3 brothers, and I'd go off to war movies with them. But it was always about combat and shooting. And I knew the songs, and I'd go on the 4th of July and see the parades, and it was always the troops. And then as I grew and got older and began to study history, and then began to be a writer, I began to ask the question, right, where were the women? After all, women are more than half the population. What were the women doing during World War II? So that question, which is, where were the women and what were they doing, started me on a mission to start going to libraries, to start going to museums, to go to historic sites, to interview women who had lived during World War II, to interview men who had these stories. Tell me your name again. Commander, your first, yes. Okay, Aradidian said to me that he remembered World War II and the big poster and the Rosie the Riveter song and the women going off to the factories. And that actually was the first book I wrote about World War II, which is Rosie the Riveter, Women Working on the Home Front in World War II, which is an extraordinary story about how women who up until the point when World War II started were told that they weren't strong enough, brave enough, smart enough, mechanically minded enough to be riveters and to drive bulldozers and to drive cranes or to be police officers or to work with explosive, to put shells together, to make jeeps, to sew parachutes. Now, when the war began and all the men went off to fight, the call went out to help wanted women. And one of the slogans that was very popular during World War II was the slogan, woman power. And that would appear on the cover of magazines such as Fortune magazine and Business Week would have the sign that would say, woman power. And women went off. Millions and millions and millions of women went off on the home front and produced the armaments, the shells, the guns, the jeeps, the parachutes, the destroyers, the Liberty ships, the airplanes, the bombers, produced such massive amounts of material that that was the key ingredient that won World War II. As the soldiers were off fighting, the production on the American home front was so extraordinary that there was this constant supply of arms that allowed the American army and the Allied armies to win the war. But that led me to another question, which was, that's what women were doing on the home front. Were women doing other things? And that's when I discovered that there were women who were members of the military and served in divisions and parts of the military and went off as Marines and as Waves and as WACs, which were the initials for women. And then I discovered an amazing thing. And probably I became interested in this because when I was a kid, about probably 8 or 9, and at that time we were living in a tiny town in northwestern Pennsylvania. It was very small. It was in the mountains. It was a river valley, so it was a very isolated town. But some friends of my parents decided to start a newspaper. And because it was a small town, there weren't a whole lot of people there who were journalists. But it happened to be that my mother had always had experience as a journalist and had written and took photographs. So my mother got a job. And although I didn't realize it at the time, she was, in fact, what we now call a photojournalist. And it was very exciting for me because when I wasn't in school, I got to go with her. So we'd go in the car and my brothers would sometimes come and she'd have her camera and she'd have her notebook and we'd go off to cover stories. And I remember at one point we went to a man named Pete Pepke. And Pete Pepke made saddles for horses. And my mother interviewed him and took photographs. And I was fascinated. I remember the smell of the leather. And I remember all the tools that he used and his love of what he did in crafting these beautiful saddles. Another time, we went to a state mental hospital because my father was a psychiatrist and we actually lived on the grounds of the state mental hospital. And it was the field day. And all the people who were patients in the state hospital gathered together to play games and to have all kinds of contests. You can imagine the contest, you know, the one where, what is it, the three-legged race? Or you do that, and the sack race and all of that. But my favorite was the watermelon eating contest, where they take a great big watermelon and then cut it in like that so you'd have the big slice. And I would just remember these people, and I thought it was a wonderful thing. I really wanted to do it, but my mother said that wouldn't be cool. I had to wait because this was a contest where people would be winning things. But I just remember the wonderful sight of people in the contest and the different ways they ate this big slice of watermelon. Some people would go like this and eat like this, but actually it was a man who won. I remember vividly, he was a man who didn't have a whole lot of teeth, and he just started at one end and managed to just suck up all that watermelon and spit out the seeds at the same time. It was incredible, and he won, and I was very excited. And my mother took pictures, and he was excited to have his picture in the paper. And then one day, we heard the rumor that a group of gypsies had come in, because Warren is sort of near, it's in the part of Pennsylvania that's a few hours away from Canada, but that a group of gypsies had come from Canada and were camping at a state park. So off we went. And I was very excited about this, but that was what my mother said, we're going to investigate this rumor. So we went, and we in fact found a group of gypsies who in fact were camping. And I remember being thrilled because my complexion, especially in the town that I was living in, you know, my hair and my eyes and my complexion and my mother were much more olive and dark skinned than most of the people in the, well, than anyone in the town that I lived in. And people would sometimes kind of comment on that, especially in the summer when I would get very, 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 very dark with the skin, and sometimes people would discriminate against me and also my mother. And I just remember being so thrilled as a little kid to meet one of the gypsy girls who had the same complexion, the same dark hair, and the same dark eyes that I had, and it was a thrilling, thrilling moment for me. But it also, I think, gave me my taste for journalism. It gave me kind of a curiosity about what it meant to go get a story and what it meant to be accurate, to talk to people and to listen to people and to write down the truth of what the reporter sees and to take photographs, because my mother would also take photographs, and her photographs about the gypsies were exciting. So no wonder when I was wondering about what women were doing in World War II, that I at some point asked the question about, were they journalists? And that's what led to my most recent book, Where the Action Was, Women War Correspondents in World War II. And what I discovered was that, in fact, there have been, starting in the 1800s, there have been, and I write about that in my book, there have been women in American history who have been journalists, despite the fact that there was enormous opposition to them being journalists. They weren't jobs that women were supposed to do. It was unwomanly. And there was a huge amount, just many, many obstacles for women to overcome, not the least of which is that when a woman went off to be a journalist, she had to wear all those, you know, clothes, all that layers of skirts and tight-fitting coats and high shoes, and had to act in a certain way, so that when women were going off in the late 1800s to cover stories, and there were women who actually covered the war, so that I knew that there were some women who had done this, including Nellie Bly. Has anybody heard the name of Nellie Bly? Yeah, right, and her famous trip around the world where she beat the record of going around the world, yeah, which is a great, and she also disguised herself and got herself committed to a mental hospital on Roosevelt Island off New York City and did an expose of the terrible conditions. Well, Nellie Bly went off to cover the war, the First World War. And there's actually a picture of her in my book where she's standing at the front line, again with all the layers of clothes and her coat and her hat, talking to actually an Austrian general. But she wrote stories about that. But the thing that I learned that was very interesting is, if the United States has not declared war or isn't fighting in the war, American women journalists had a lot of freedom to be able to cover the war. Once the United States officially declares war, and the war that President Bush declared on terrorism is not an officially declared war in the way that World War II was officially declared, then the situation becomes very different. Because once it's an officially declared war, journalists have to become accredited by the United States and World War II War Office, and they have to go through a whole process. And that's the process that was used to keep out women who wanted to be journalists. And that's the part of my book that I'm really interested in, was how did some women manage to not only get accredited, which they did, which meant that, let's say you wanted to get accredited, that you have been a journalist and you were writing for a newspaper and you wanted to go cover the war. What you would first need to do is go to a newspaper or a magazine and get them to hire you and agree to pay your salary and all your expenses for going off to war. Then you'd need to fill out a huge application and give all kinds of personal information that would then go to the War Department that would then investigate you. Talk to family, talk to friends, look in your background, see if you had ever done anything that would make you not a good security risk. Then after you had gone through all of those hoops, you had to then go to the commanding officer who would decide whether or not you would be accredited. And if you were a woman, most likely you would not be accredited. And actually the first woman who was accredited, who managed to get an accreditation, was a young woman, and I'll just show you where she is on the book, because I know some of you won't be able to see her, but her name was Peggy Hall. Can some of you see, can you see in the back a very, very young woman standing in a very straight kind of way? Well, that's Peggy Hall in 1916, even before our oldest person was born. And what's interesting is she went off to cover her first war, which was a military action on the Texas-Mexican border, where General John Pershing went off to capture Pancho Villa. Any of you heard his name? So Peggy Hall went off to cover that story. Then when World War I broke out in 1914, she went to France. Now the United States wasn't in the war then, and she started writing stories that were so dramatic and so full of interest that newspapers all over America published them. But guess what? The male correspondents got really jealous because Peggy Hall was getting more press coverage than they were. So when the United States entered the war, the male journalists complained and said, she's not accredited. So Peggy Hall had to leave and go back to America. So she went to Washington, and here's a good lesson in life. What Peggy Hall did is she went to Washington and she walked the halls. She knocked on doors. She talked to people. She went on and on and on and on until finally she found an officer whom she had met when she was covering the fighting on the Texas-Mexican border, and they were friends, and he now had gotten promoted, and so he wrote a letter to the man who was refusing to accredit Peggy Hall and said, if the reason you're refusing to accredit her is because she's a woman, then cease and desist and accredit her. So Peggy Hall is the first woman in 1918 to get accredited. And she went off with the American military. It was the American Expeditionary Forces in 1918 that went to Siberia, which is part of Russia. Now, one of the wonderful things about being a writer is, I'm sure some of you, including the adults, are sitting here saying, I didn't know that. Did some of you know that the Americans sent troops, American Expeditionary, some of you knew that, to Siberia in 1918? Okay, so some people did, but did you know that? I didn't know that, and that's the exciting thing about being a writer, is I'm reading all these things and saying, this is fabulous. This is really exciting. This is really good stuff. So I decided to start my book because no war, as I'm sure you know, no war starts at the moment that one nation says, we're at war. There's always a history that leads up to the outbreak of the war. And in this case, I decided to start my book in the 1930s. And I started it with a first line, and as a writer, one of the things that's really fun about being a writer is, and those of you who write, that's a kind of that excitement where you write a good sentence. You know that fun, and you say, oh yes, that's a good sentence. Well, whether you like this sentence or not is okay. You don't have to like this sentence, but I love this sentence. This is the first sentence in my book. With a knapsack and $50, Martha Gellhorn traveled to Spain to cover her first war. the Spanish Civil War. Do you like that sentence? That's a good sentence. And what was very exciting for me about Martha Gellhorn is that as I started to research my book, Martha Gellhorn not only goes off to cover the Spanish Civil War, but then she goes to Czechoslovakia in 1938 when Hitler takes over Czechoslovakia, which was very personal for me because my mother was from Czechoslovakia, and my mother was in Czechoslovakia in 1938, that same summer that Hitler took over and the Germans took over that country. So that was, I thought, wow, my mother was in that country when that was going on, and Martha Gellhorn was there too, writing about it for Collier's magazine. Martha Gellhorn was in Finland when the Russians attacked. Martha Gellhorn then left and went to live in Cuba with Ernest Hemingway, of all people, whom she then ended up marrying. But then she comes back and covers the war. And she's an extraordinary journalist. When she's denied the right to cover D-Day, you know what she does? Because she was determined to do her job, she sneaked aboard a hospital transport ship, got on board in the night, hid in the bathroom, so that she landed on the Normandy beach on D-Day +1 with the first hospital ship that went to retrieve wounded soldiers and brought them back, and went onto the beach and worked with the stretcher bearers, worked with the nurses, worked on the beach, even though there was flak and there was attacks going on, came back on the ship and got an incredible story. Another woman, Lee Carson, who was another journalist, got aboard a plane, talked her way into getting on an aerial plane that was spotting as Normandy was going on, and got a first-hand view of what was going on. And it was the things that the women would go to. For what Martha Gellhorn did, she was arrested because she defied orders. When her story appeared, of course, the military knew that she had defied the orders, so she was arrested and confined behind barbed wire. How long do you think she lasted being confined behind barbed wire? About a day. She climbed the fence, climbed over the barbed wire, jumped to the ground, made her way to the airport, to London, and created this whole big story about how her fiancé was in Naples, Italy, and he was about to be shipped, and she needed to see him to say farewell. So as a young pilot, believed her story, flew her to Naples, at which point Martha then hooked up with the French army, because the French army was fighting the war that went all the way up through Italy, and covered the war moving with the French army that allowed her. So these are the kinds of stories and the kinds of lengths that women went to. And I could go on and on and on with the stories of daring, the stories of Iris Carpenter being in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. She was moving with the First Army and being pinned down by German planes that were strafing, you know, machine gunning. Dickie Chappelle, who goes to Iwo Jima, and she's in the middle of a firefight, and there's snipers shooting at her. But you know what the problem is Dickie Chappelle didn't realize they were snipers. She thought they were insects buzzing until she got back to her ship and found out that Iwo Jima was a volcanic island, and so those weren't insects, those were snipers shooting. Whenever I start a book, each book I write, and actually this is altogether my 14th book. Some of my other books, some of you may have heard of Corpses, Coffins, and Crypts, A History of Burial, Toilets, Bathtubs, Sinks, and Sewers. So you see I write on a whole range of subjects. But each book gets a box. And I have 14 of these boxes stacked up in my house. And it has a cover like this, and it's got handles like this. And I start my box as a way of starting to fill in all the information that I need as I'm doing my research. And this box has all kinds of things. And then when I'm done with the book, it gets stored. I store it. And for example, in this box, here are my note cards as I began to take notes. Now, I have different other kinds of, there's another file here that's also full of notes. But these particular note cards were there so that I could follow the chronology. And you notice that there are different colors to the note cards. I'm sure you all probably know that the reason they're different colors is because it's color-coded, and you're right. Yellow is for the women I decided to write about, and green are the headlines, our newspaper headlines, and then the pink is all the information about the war. And one of the things that I decided to do with this book, and I actually went in and talked to the designer at Random House to see if this was possible, is I wanted to start each chapter with a headline. Can you all see that? And what I did is I was allowed to do this because one of the things that the publisher makes are these things that are called page proofs. And this is a part of the publishing stage where the publisher produces the book on the paper that it's going to be on to make sure that everything looks good and everything's right before they go to the expense of putting the book then in the cover. And so one of the things that I did was with these headlines, because I wanted to make sure that I had, that I had the chronology just right, is that I took off the first page and I put the headline from the Washington Post, U.S. warships sent to aid citizens in Spain. And then chapter 2, German army attacks Poland. You see that? And that's a headline from the New York Times. New York Herald Tribune, Germany invades Holland by land. And this is the way that when you're reading the book, you can follow the history. You can follow what's going on through newspapers all over the country. Because what I wanted to do with this book is I didn't just want to write about the women in terms of like a biography. Margaret Bourke-White, Dickie Chappelle, Martha Gellhorn. I wanted readers, including myself, because first of all, when you write a book, you're writing a book that is most interesting, you know, for me to write, was to understand what it was like for these women as the events of the war unfolded. What it was like to cover the war before the United States entered, and to have the freedom to move and to write, to then having, once the United States entered the war, to then having to go through all those hoops and to have to defy all those orders and to how to figure out how to get around getting to where the action was, even though you might be arrested or lose your accreditation. And so I wanted to follow the war and follow what the women did. And the most amazing thing as I wrote my book was I started with Martha Gellhorn. And I didn't realize until I was well into doing my research that Martha Gellhorn, who has heard about Dachau, her infamous concentration camp, which was built in 1933, and Martha Gellhorn heard about it in 1937, that when the war ended, when Germany surrendered, Martha Gellhorn coincidentally was in Dachau. That's where she heard the news. And she wrote a very powerful article for Collier's magazine about there was no better place, she thought, to hear that Germany had surrendered than for her to be in Dachau, which surely, she wrote, this war was about, so that places like this would never exist. In terms of the writing process and my book, my box here, some of the other things that I put is, this is what the publisher sends back to me. This notebook, and every book gets a notebook, has the manuscript in it that I send to the publisher. And it's, you know, we go back and forth this way, and my editor makes comments, and I make comments, and in the back I have all the pictures that I'm sending to the publisher because I also do all my photo research. And then there's a point at which, after we've gone back and forth, that the editor sends me this, which are called galleys. And the galleys, again, we send them back and forth, and they have the pictures, and I read them, and you can't see it, I'm sure, in the back, but right here in blue pencil, I've made comments and I've made changes, and I send this back then to the editor, and that gets entered in, and we go back and forth, and we go back and forth until finally the editor says, enough, Penny, enough, that's it. we've got to get this book published. And then this comes out. And this is what's called, at the top, it says Advanced Galley, Not for Sale. And this is people like Lillian, who's the sales representative, takes this bound galley, and it's not complete. It doesn't have all the pictures, and it's not fully corrected. And there are notices in it that says, you know, not for sale, uncorrected. But the sales reps love that, and people like Bob Brown love this, because then Lillian goes to Bob Brown and says, here's this exciting book coming out. And this is for all books come out in this form, so that they can then place orders. Then this thing comes out, which I was showing you earlier, which are the page proofs, which is the book on the final paper. And if this then gets approved, we end up with the final book. And then once the final book comes out, I take all my notes and all my files. Here's an example. You can see I did red. This is Teresa Bonet, and the green, Margaret Bork White. The red means that this has articles that I got from the library, articles they wrote, and then the green means that this is where all the pictures are. And I take all these files, and I very carefully organize everything, and I put the top on my box, and I store it, and I go on to another book. But whenever I finish a book, particularly a book like this one, where I get to meet extraordinarily courageous and extraordinarily ingenious, extraordinarily committed people, in this case women, who were determined to do their job, and determined, most of all, what the women were determined to do was to tell the truth, to tell the whole truth about war. And Martha Gellhorn wrote about the fact that while she noticed that male journalists rarely went to hospitals, she always went to hospitals, because that's where you really see the cost of war. Tony Frizzell took pictures to show people what war costs to the children, to the women, to the soldiers, to the landscape, to all the animals that get killed during war. And what these women believed is, first of all, that they had a job to do, and they were going to do it. And they also believed that if somehow they could tell the truth of war in all the dimensions of war, that people then would decide there had to be a better way to live. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Penny. Anyone have questions?
How long did it take you to write your book?
Well, actually, I knew I was going to be asked that question because it's a typical one. So I actually checked. And it was in 1998, because in one of my files is all my correspondence with the editor. And in 1998, I started the conversations with the editor, late 1998. In 1999, I agreed to write the book, and I started writing. And when I start writing a book, that's all I do. So when I'm telling you the time, that means that I was working 7 days a week, sometimes 12, sometimes 17 hours a day, just immersed in this book. And I finished the book a year later. It was actually in a year, and probably a year and a half later is when I actually finished everything. Then we start that writing, then we start that whole process, and then the book came out on February 12th of this year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So you have to figure out how many years that was. Sorry.
How many books have you written in your career?
14, although I've also written other books for adults, 10 of them about women, social histories of women, and then, as I said, the other ones on the history of burial and the history of bathrooms and a variety of other things. I've written also lots and lots of magazine articles, essays. You can actually check my website, and I've actually posted some of my articles, some of my essays, and it's kind of sort of fun to read that, because I know you're all being asked to write articles and essays too, so you can see those. Thank you. When
did you know you wanted to be a writer?
Oh goodness, that's interesting. I I actually was very late in life. When I was young, what I wanted to do is I wanted to be a drummer. And actually, my son Stephen tells the story that all his growing up when he was little, he remembers me saying that when I grew up, I want to be a drummer. And then Stephen said one day when he was about 6 or 7, he suddenly realized I was already grown up, so why wasn't I a drummer? And then I wanted to be a helicopter pilot. I really wanted to be a helicopter pilot. I still want to be a helicopter pilot who drums. But all along the way, I also wrote, and it was actually in 1987 when I made the decision that I was going to be a full-time writer. And it was more because I was filled with things that I had to say. And I don't have a good enough voice to be a singer, and I'm not agile enough to be a dancer, and let me see, and I'm not talented enough to be a painter, but I can write, and I had to say these things, so I picked writing.
Thank you. What were some of the things that you also wrote before you started writing books?
I wrote articles about education. I wrote essays about flying kites with my dad. You mean that? On other topics? Gosh, I did a lot of sports. I wrote the cover story for Sports Illustrated for Kids called Girls in Sports, which was very exciting. I wrote about taking a whitewater raft trip down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. I wrote that for Sports Illustrated for Kids. Probably my favorite story for Sports Illustrated for Kids is I went to Massachusetts to 2 schools, one in Boston and one in a small town, to write about, you know, what do you do? It's in the gym where they have all the ropes and the things, it's like an outward, huh? Yeah, it's all that kind of stuff. And it was a place that was set up with all this equipment, and I was writing about kids who were doing all this climbing. But before we started, the head of it said, Penny, why don't you go try that first? Which meant me walking up these pegs way high up in a tree and then turning around on a little tiny platform, and there was in front of me a cable that was no bigger than that I had to walk across. And so that was my most incredible story, is because there were all these kids, and I knew that I couldn't like cry or scream or refuse to do it. I had to do it, and I had a safety belt on me, but it was really scary because every step I took, the wire would go doing, but I did it. So that's what I did, a lot of sports too. Thanks.
Out of your 14 books, which one was your favorite?
Oh gosh, when people ask me that question, I always say, like my kids, they're each my favorite in a different way.
Thank you.
I could ask you, when you read all my 14 books, you can send me an email and tell me which one's your favorite, okay?
Do you put any of your own experiences into your books?
Yes, I do. I more put my own experiences into my articles and into my essays, but I certainly put my own experiences. If you read my book, Corpses, Coffins, and Crypts, A History of Burial, which was an amazing book to write, I made the decision, because I know death is a very painful and difficult subject and a scary subject, that if I was going to write about this, I needed to write about my experiences. So I write about my brother dying when he was 20, my father dying when he was 50. So I very much put myself, I write in the I in that book. I put my experiences in, as I said, in World War II, although you won't see me writing about I talked about being a kid and watching my mother be a journalist. Okay, thank you.
Did you like to write when you were a kid?
Yes, I did like to write. And my brothers and I started an orchestra when I was about probably 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We had an orchestra, and I discovered, going through some old papers, you know how your parents are saving papers, that I actually started a newsletter. And one of the interesting things that I started this newsletter writing about our orchestra, one of the things that I noticed about my writing is I love to write about the sounds. So my writing is full of me trying to figure out how to write about the sound that a violin makes, or a cello makes, or a clarinet makes. So I did that.
Was it difficult to get people to interview for your books?
Yes, sometimes it is. Part of it is because I write history, and many people are just they've died. In terms of writing this World War II book, virtually all the women had already died by the time I started to write the book. or people are old and they don't, it's just hard for them to remember and to talk. So sometimes it is. With Corpses, Coffins, and Crypts, it turned out to be easy because at first people would say, oh no, you're not writing about that, that's terrible. But then if I'd wait, everybody had a story that they wanted to tell me. So it was kind of a mix.
When did you write your first book?
Started writing my first book in 1991, and it was published, my first two books were published in 1992, Spies, Women in the Civil War, and Breaking the Chains, The Crusade of Dorothea Lynn Dix. So any of you who are despairing about what you're going to be when you grow up, don't worry about it, because I didn't decide what I was going to be till I grew up until I was 45 years old. So don't worry, don't fret a whole lot about it.
Thank you. What was your favorite book that you read when you were little?
Oh, gosh. Oh. Gosh, I'm not sure. I have to tell you, I mostly read nonfiction. So it would mostly be, I couldn't probably tell you as much about the favorite book, but I just loved reading I loved reading biographies, I loved reading adventures, I loved reading about spies, I just sort of loved reading the back of the cereal box, the newspaper. I just kind of loved reading everything. Do you have a favorite book?
Not really.
Not really, yeah. Okay.
Of all the books that you've ever read, which one is your favorite and why?
Of all the books that
You've ever read?
I've ever read, which is my favorite?
Yeah.
Well, I'd have to say that, again, because I'm passionate about nonfiction, I don't tend to read books that would be familiar to anyone, because what I read is I read diaries, I read journals, I read old musty things in archives, and so it's really hard to answer that because it's the whole collection of writing that I read, mostly by people who haven't ever been published. Their voices and their words and their images by people that just thrill me and excite me.
How do you decide on what you're going to write about?
They're actually, when I first started to come in to do school groups, I just realized that I should really think about that question. So I analyzed everything that I've written, and I came up with these basic ideas of how. One is, what I decide to write about is something that matches my interests, something that I'm passionate about, something that I'm really interested about, because writing is really, really hard. And with a book like Where the Action Is, it's constant revision. I must have revised this manuscript 21, 22, 23 times. And I love the revision process. It's just getting it just right. But that's hard work. So it's got to be something that I'm interested in. Sometimes what I decide to write about is what I call snippets, snippets and stories. I'll just hear something that catches my ear. Like one day my son Stephen came down and said he had a glass of milk. I mean, he had a bowl of cereal and a glass of milk. And in the glass of milk, he crumpled up Oreos. And in the bowl of cereal, he put potato chips and a scoop of ice cream and milk. And I looked at him and I said, Stephen, what is that? And he said, I don't know. It's, weird and wacky recipe, I guess. Well, that phrase, weird and wacky, caught my imagination. So I did this whole big research project. I interviewed people everywhere. Go into a deli, I'd stop people on the street and I'd ask them if they had a weird and wacky recipe. And I wrote a whole big article about it. So I guess that's another way. Sometimes an editor will request me. Sometimes I'll get a letter from an editor saying, would you be interested in writing about that? Sometimes I write about strong emotions, strong sensations. My essay about flying kites with my father comes out of a very strong sensation and emotion.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you only write in the nonfiction genre?
I have written, now, yes. I have written fiction. I actually started out writing fiction for kids, which was really, really fun. I loved writing just the freedom and the fun of fiction and being able, when you get stuck, you just can use your imagination. But now I write exclusively in nonfiction because I love the challenge of it, because it's hard. Because you have to have this, it has to have a story. It's got to be engaging. It's got to be compelling. and I still have to stick with what I can verify as the facts and what's true. So I love the challenge. I always kind of like doing things that are hard.
Of all the women you've written about, which do you admire the most?
Which do I admire the most? Again, I admire them for different reasons. In my family, we have kind of catchwords. For example, if someone says, like one of my sons says, I did a Fannie Lou Hamer, who I've written about, who's a great civil rights activist. Fannie Lou Hamer was so determined as an African-American woman to vote that she went to register in the 1960s, even though it meant she was fired from her job, shot at, lost her home, beaten up, jailed. And so in my family, if you've done a Fannie Lou Hamer, that means you stand up for what's right no matter what the consequences are. So I admire Fannie Lou Hamer. I admire Frances Perkins, who was first Secretary of Labor. And any of you who have minimum hours and maximum hours and minimum wage and hear about Social Security, Frances Perkins is the person who was behind that. But Frances Perkins believed in compromise. And that's something I'm not so good at. So I admire Frances Perkins for that. I really admire Madam C.J. Walker because she just said, I'm going to do something with my life. So all of them have very strong characteristics that live in my head and live in my heart, and I draw on them for inspiration every day.
What motivated you to write about women in history?
What motivated me to write women's history?
Yeah.
Because they're the very best stories.
Thank you.
Because those of you, and I have to tell you, I have 3 brothers and 3 sons, and they agree with me because, as they said to me, women who did these extraordinary things just didn't do these extraordinary things. They had to jump over all these obstacles and all these hurdles and put up with all this, all these difficulties along the way. So there's another layer. There's another aspect to writing about women that makes it very intriguing and very exciting. And also because in writing about women, I've come to meet and to know men, boys and men of goodwill who are not threatened and who are just as excited and willing and happy to play soccer, to work alongside, to do stories with women, as they are with other men. And I've gotten to meet those boys and those men in my writing.
What is your favorite part of the writing process?
Revising. I know that sounds crazy. The hardest part of the writing process is the pre-writing process where I'm trying to figure out how to structure the book. It's agony. It's agony. Last night, actually, it's when I'm thinking deeply about something. Last night, I was thinking deeply about this presentation, talking to you all, and I was at the Jersey Shore, and I left about 10 o'clock, and I started driving north to New York City. Somehow, at some point, I made the wrong turn, and at midnight, I discovered that I was in Trenton, which meant I was going south. So somehow, but that happens when I'm doing deep thinking. When I'm doing deep thinking about a book, I'll go to the grocery store and say I'll be home in 15 minutes, and I'll be home hours later. I once was driving to a radio interview in Philadelphia and ended up in Baltimore. So that's a really, really, really hard phase. That's not my favorite. The revising is my favorite because I love working with the text. I love working with the words to get it just right. I find that fascinating. And I love the sense of power. I love the power in being able to look at a sentence and saying, gosh, if I change this word, or if I delete this, or if I do this, it's just right. And I go, yay, Penny. That's such a good word, such a good sentence. So I like that.
What do you do when you get a writer's block?
I don't, because I just pin up a bill. I started writing when my 3 sons were in college. So writer's block is not anything, because this is what I do for a living. This is my job. So a writer's block, if my writing isn't coming very smoothly, then I do something physical. I go run. I ride my bicycle. I do something, and no offense to anybody, but if I do something that I'll start sweating, at that point, it's like it clears my brain, and then I can go back to doing my work. But doing something physical is a really good thing to do. If that happens to you, the worst thing you can do is just like sit. I also never watch TV. I don't go to movies that are violent, anything that's going to disrupt what goes on in my brain. I take really good care. I make sure I get enough sleep. I don't let stuff come into my brain that's going to freak me out, because then there's no room for the writing.
What is the next book you're planning on writing?
The next book I'm planning on writing is, actually there are a couple of directions I'm going in. One direction I'm going in is I'm writing, again, somebody asked me about putting myself in my books. For years I've been traveling all over the country, going to cemeteries, going to historic sites, looking for markers, for monuments, going to places where significant events happened in history, really important events. And I'm going to be writing about that using my own photographs, because I do a lot of photography. So it's going to be a travel. I love road trips. I just get in my car and I take off and I drive across the country, drive to Denver, drive whatever. So I'm going to be writing about my travels, why I do it, what I see, what I've learned from. The other book I'm working on is I want to look at the period just before women got the vote in this country, because there was a period when women started picketing the White House, and they were arrested, taken to Lorton, Virginia, where there was a workhouse, a prison, and then were force-fed because the women said they were political prisoners. And some of these were society women, some of these were working women, some were old women, some were young women. But the government ordered these women to be force-fed, to have tubes rammed down their nose and into their stomach. And most people don't know that story, that that's what women went through in this country to get the vote. So I'm writing a book about what was it that it came to this point, this great democracy, where the citizens, the women, had to go to the lengths of being willing to be force-fed in order to get the vote. So I'm very excited about that book, too.
Future, would you write a biography about yourself?
People ask me that. Probably not. Although there are pieces about myself that you'll find on my website. But I guess I'm probably just so, I know this sounds silly, but I kind of know my biography, and I'm really more interested about learning about all these people and events that I don't know about. But I do put things on my website, and when I teach, I talk about that. And if you have any questions, you can send me an email, and I'd be happy to answer you. Yes.
What was the hardest book to research?
That's a really good question. Probably Girls, A History of Growing Up Female in America, because I was determined to start in pre-colonial time and come all the way through American history, and I was determined to find the words and the stories and the material objects from girls' lives. And of course, that's not anything that's been valued and has been kept. So I had to do a lot of traveling and a lot of really, really hard research to write that book. So that probably was the hardest in terms of the research. That's an interesting question. Thank you. Okay.
Well, when I introduced Penny earlier on, I mentioned, the last thing I mentioned was that she's at Teachers College in Columbia University. And I think the program we've had today really indicates that she is a teacher. She made terrific contact with all of you, and you with her. I hope you came away with the feeling that I had about the writing process, that it's a wonderful thing, particularly the way Penny describes it, and perhaps you've picked up some tips and some techniques that you can use. But needless to say, we'd like to thank her for spending this time with us. Let's. And once again, we'd like to thank members of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, Mr. Didion, and the Commander of the American Legion, Miss Ray. And Mrs. Lillian Pinchansky from Random House, thank you. And of course, we're so fortunate to have a wonderful bookstore here in Glen Rock, and a proprietor like Mr. Brown, who's always thinking of us here. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. You were great. Thanks.
Penny Colman is author of Rosie the Riveter, Girls, A History of Growing Up Female in America, and her latest, Where the Action Was, Women War Correspondents in World War II. It's published by Crown. Visit randomhouse.com/teens for more information. Next week on Children's Books, author Jerry Chase Ferris instructs students on the process of writing biographies. You can find out about the programs and authors featured on Children's Books online. Visit our website, booktv.org, and click on Children's Books.